generally conducted according to Ghana's electoral laws and procedures. While there were some challenges, the challenges were isolated and did not undermine the process's overall credibility. Respect to arrival of polling stations. Upon arrival, CODEO observers in 87.2% met election officials present at their assigned polling stations. However, in 12.8% of the polling stations, CODEO observers did not see election officials when they arrived. It is worthy to note that by rule, CODEO observers are expected to arrive at their polling stations by 6 a.m. Therefore, not seeing election officials upon arrival does not connote lateness on the part of election officials. In 99.9% of polling stations, electoral officials respected CODEO observers' status as the Electoral Commission's accredited election observers and permitted them to observe the polls. By 7:15 a.m., over half of the polling stations, that is 65.7%, had opened. Another 28.8% opened between 7:16 and 8 a.m., adding up to 94.5% opening by 8 a.m. Most of the polling stations, that is 72.5%, had the required number of election officials, that is up to 6. Another 18.6% had 5 officials, and 5.9% had 4 officials, and 2.3% had between 1 to 3 officials. In terms of gender, 87.3% of presiding officers were males, and 12.7% were females. The setup of most polling stations ensured that persons with mobility challenges, that is, the disabled and the elderly, could easily access them, that is 94.5%, and all voters could cast their ballots in secret, that is in 91.8%. Everybody was able to cast his vote in secrecy. At the time of setup, CODEO observers reported seeing polling agents of the 2 main political parties present in almost all polling stations, that's MPP and NDC. MPP 99.6%, NDC 99.1%. In 50% of the polling stations, none of the agents of the other political parties and independent candidates were present. According to CODEO observation, that is in 1% of polling stations had 3 biometric devices. In 84%, there were 2 biometric devices. In 14% had 1 device, and in 1% had none. CODEO observers' report showed that 92.6% of the polling stations had their sensitive materials available. That is, the ballot box, ballot papers, indelible ink, voting screen, validating stamp, ink pad, endorsing ink, and tactile ballot papers, and etc. However, 6% of the polling stations were missing. In 6% of the polling stations, tactile ballot boxes were missing. According to the observers, in 99.6% of the polling stations, ballot booklets were serialized numerically. The presidential and parliamentary ballot boxes were shown to be empty, sealed, and placed in public view before the commencement of voting in 99.6% of the polling stations. CODEO observers reported seeing stationed roaming and stationed security personnel at 85.2% of polling stations. Only 14.8% of the polling stations were reported to be without security personnel. The police stopped the list of security officials deployed for the election in 53.5%, followed by uniformed personnel from other security services, that is 21.8% from the Ghana Armed Forces, 5.4%, and the National Security, 2.6%. CODEO observers' report show that security personnel were unarmed in 69.9% of polling stations. Nearly a quarter of the polling stations, that is 23.3%, had armed security personnel. CODEO observers found COVID-19 safety materials available at most polling stations. That is the thermometer gun that was found in 95% of the stations, hand washing facility, this included soap and water, 94% of the polling stations, hand sanitizers, 93% of the polling stations, and sanitizer wipes, 78%. Less than 1% of polling stations lacked these protocol materials. Voting. At 92.3% of polling stations, no unauthorized persons were allowed to be present during the voting. CODEO observers in all polling stations at 100% reported that election officials validated, that is, stamped ballot papers before they were issued to voters. In almost all polling stations, at 96.3%, voters' fingers were marked with indelible ink. The biometric verification machines worked perfectly in 89.7% of polling stations. However, the devices failed to function correctly at some point in 10.3% of the polling stations. No significant incident of harassment or intimidation of voters or polling officials were recorded in 97.7% of the polling stations during the voting process, except a few isolated cases in some of the observed polling stations. In most polling stations, that is in 95.5%, the elderly, pregnant women, nursing mothers, and persons with disabilities were given priority to vote before others. Social distancing and hand washing were strictly enforced in 74.3% and 92.7% respectively of the polling stations. At 45.2% of polling stations, a few, that is in our designation, when we say a few, we mean between 1 to 5, some between 6 to 15, and many 16 and more, voters did not wear face masks. CODEO observers in 54.8% of polling stations, however, reported that voters wore face masks. Indeed, election officials in 16.3% of polling stations turned away a few. That is between 1 to 5, some between 6 to 15, and many, that is 16 and above, voters who were not wearing face masks. We just want to indicate that there were cases where voters who came without wearing the face mask were turned away. In 98.3% of polling stations, election officials did not permit any individual to vote without going through either biometric, facial, or manual verification. Election officials in most polling stations, that is 92.7%, never denied any voter needing assistance to vote the right to have a person of his or her own choice to assist him or her in going through the voting process. In the vast majority of polling stations, that is 90.3%, no eligible voter with a valid voter identity card, but whose name was not in the voter register, was denied his or her voting right. Indeed, election officials in 5.1% polling stations permitted a few, that is between 1 to 5, some, that is between 6 to 15, or 16 and above,